Thanks so much for coming. I'm Tom McTague. I'm the political editor here at UnHerd, and this is the great Helen Thompson, who's Professor of Political Economy at Cambridge. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, this is a special live These Times event here at the UnHerd Club in London. These Times is something Helen and I do every week, a weekly podcast about geopolitics and history, where we try and look at the week's event, the main event that we think is important that week, and try to understand what's really going on, what the history, how do we get here, what does it mean for the future. So in this episode, we're going to look at the United States election, why we think we are where we are today after, the last 4 years of it's really quite tumultuous politics, both domestically and in foreign policy terms. How did we go from January 6th, 2021 to today, where the polling averages are absolutely remarkably tied, according to the New York Times average polls that were published. Well, we were looking at them earlier today, and in all the major swing states, they're within 1 point of each other. So I think currently, if Kamala Harris was to win those states where she's 1 point ahead, she would claim the presidency. But the polls both underestimated Trump in 2016 and 2020. So, Helen, we're going to start with domestically. And as I say, the polls being so kind of remarkably close, with only 2 weeks to go. But I think this is important, with the momentum clearly coming towards Donald Trump now, it seems. I think Kamala Harris was 5 points clear a month ago, and now they're tied. So give us your view of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, in a way, I think that the remarkable thing is that the United States is heading for another extremely tight election, comparable to what happened in a structural sense in 2020, where, if you recall, it actually took some weeks after the election for it to become clear that Biden had won. But if we go back to the beginning of the Biden presidency, I think it would be quite difficult to imagine that the contest for the presidency would be between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. When we were talking earlier, I was thinking, well, actually, there's kind of like been 4 possible contests that we've been through, or the Americans, I shouldn't say we here, have been through to get to this point. If we start on the Democratic side, then Biden's initial pledge was to be a one-term president. He was going to be the transition president to somebody younger. It looked like that was going to be Kamala Harris. If you look on the Republican side, at least I'd say by sort of some point into 2021, building momentum through the midterm elections of 2022, it looked like the rising star was Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor. The way that he had governed Florida during the pandemic in a much more liberal way, fewer lockdowns, policies, vaccine mandates, etc., than in many, certainly the Democratic states, and the fight that he had with Disney about Disney's privileges in Florida. He was the rising star, and Trump, as the person who had been complicit in the events of January the 6th, particularly trying to stop his vice president from validating the election in the Senate, looked like he'd blown things, both by his behaviour at that point, but also by the fact that in the 2022 midterm elections, that the candidates that Trump backed did very, very badly, whereas DeSantis won re-election in Florida by 19 points. So all the momentum seemed, by this point, on the Republican side, to be in DeSantis's direction. But if you look at what was going on the Democratic side by 2022, those midterm elections, we can already see the ground moving away from Kamala Harris. There's already briefing that Biden's going to run again. April 2023, he does run, or he does announce that he's going to run. A month later, then DeSantis announces his candidature. So at this point, you could say the direction of travel is towards a Biden-DeSantis, maybe, contest. But very quickly, once DeSantis is running as a candidate, it becomes clear that he's nowhere near as effective nationally as looked like would be the case, and Trump is resurgent. DeSantis actually only stays in for the Iowa caucus. So already 2 days before the New Hampshire primary, he's dropping out. And all the momentum is with Trump. Now we're heading for a Trump-Biden. So this is kind of like the third version of the contest that's going to take place. And that gets overwhelmed by a sequence of things, some of which I think we're going to talk about in the moment, which is the domestic problems that Biden faced, but most clearly his age, his health, and the fact that these issues were coming to a head at just that point when Trump was, well, there was the first attempted assassination of Trump, and he was literally rising from the ground with his fist in the air under an American flag. And the contrast between what seemed like his almost symbolic American virility and Biden was so overwhelming within a few weeks that Biden had been pushed out. And now we're at this contest between Kamala Harris and Trump. But I think that what that means, who Kamala Harris is, and interestingly, increasingly so, who Donald Trump is actually really unclear. Is Donald Trump the person who picked Vance as his vice presidential candidate, and did so because Vance represents the turn of the Republican Party back to trying to win working class voters for economic reasons? Or is Donald Trump the man who's campaigning with Elon Musk? Are those things actually compatible with each other? Is he the man who's backed by the Heritage Foundation? And I think that the answers to these questions are like far from certain. So in some sense, there's kind of projection on both sides of voters into who that these people who they've got to choose between actually are.
Yeah, I was going to say, because at the same time as there are this sort of confusion about it's not so much who Donald Trump is, but what a future presidency would be, what a second-term presidency would be. There is also this confusion about what the Democratic Party is. What is the offer? You know, I was speaking to friends in the US over the last few days, and they were saying Biden was a particular offer. There's like a counter-Trump offer in 2020. He was the sort of the normal non-woke candidate that they were able to put forward. But actually they didn't then have a replacement non-woke candidate to step into Biden's shoes. So they had to go with Kamala Harris. Now she is then trying to run on a certain type of election campaign, but it's not necessarily one that's easy for her to run on given her background. So I think that's one problem. Is, you know, there are sort of fundamental weaknesses on both sides, it seems.
Yeah, and if we just push that a bit further, Tom, how would you see the way in which the Democratic switch from Biden to Harris played out? Because I think if you look at the Republican, why did we not end up with DeSantis? Why did the Republicans end up with Trump and not DeSantis? Ultimately, the explanation is not so difficult. It is that DeSantis proved incapable of articulating an economic message that could appeal to the kind of cross-class coalition that Trump had managed to put together both in 2016 and 2020. And he was too far to the right on various cultural issues, including abortion, where Trump is actually pretty pragmatic compared to that. But the story of how the Democrats went from the sort of package of weaknesses and strengths that Biden had to the package of general weaknesses in lots of ways that Harris had, and the fact that the boost that she had pretty much came from the fact that Biden was replaced, and that the issue of asking Democratic voters to vote for somebody in as poor health as Biden was taken away has left them in a very different position. That isn't to say I think that Trump doesn't bring a whole bundle of weaknesses and contradictions with him, but they're a bit different than this story, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was putting this question to my American colleague, Emily Jashinsky, who was saying that in some senses you would look at Kamala Harris's weaknesses and say, well, why isn't Trump further ahead? Why isn't he clearly winning? The Republican Party should be able to win this election, particularly given some of the things that we'll talk about in terms of the US economy, in terms of the migration issue at the moment. There are specific weaknesses that the Democrats have. I've got to say, I mean, I don't know about how you felt, but I was particularly surprised at the surge in support for Kamala Harris after she came in. Like I looked at her and I didn't think that this was a sensible move. That if they were really serious about replacing Biden at that time when it wasn't clear whether he was going to go, that they surely would look at a different candidate, or they would seriously look at a different candidate because of her obvious weaknesses. And then to see her then pull quite clearly into the lead, into like a 5-point lead quite quickly, I was surprised about that. But then it's almost like it hasn't, although it was so late in the day, it hasn't quite come late enough. She still has the record that she has to defend, but also the fundamentals of the last 4 years, I think, start to assert themselves, don't they? And those are quite clearly inflation. So, because when you look at the numbers on the face of it, the economic numbers, Biden's record is clearly pretty good in many respects. In terms of economic growth per capita in the United States, it all looks pretty good, but especially compared to the UK or anywhere in Europe. I mean, I think it was the IMF report, was it yesterday or 2 days ago, saying that the bulk of the growth in the Western world is going to be coming from the United States. This is the kind of powerhouse economy. But then you drill down, don't have to drill down that far, and you look at the inflation figures, and they are really quite striking. So I think inflation peaked at something like 10%.
Just under 10%, I think it's 9 point something percent.
9 point something. And then we were looking at the two issues in particular that seem to be hitting people, gas price inflation and food inflation. And food inflation was really startlingly high. I think I had a number somewhere in here.
I think it's cumulatively more than 20% over the 4-year period.
Yeah, and then so the way it was described to me is quite spotty. So it's like, certain things are really high, and then gas prices jumped up by 50% in 1 year. This was a moment that you and I have talked about in the podcast where Biden really starts to break with his Middle East policy, and he goes to bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, essentially pleading with him to turn on the taps. And this was a repudiation of he'd come into office really trying to distance himself from bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and effectively trying to keep open the option that he might be bypassed and that they could look to a different Saudi leader. So I think that is one particularly telling issue at the moment in the US election that perhaps we don't see as much here. And then the second issue is migration. And again, the numbers are really quite startling once you dig into it. So I think that the baseline figures are that there have been, the way they measure it seems to be quite different from the way we measure it, but it's something called encounters at the border is what they measure. So how many times do they see somebody trying to cross illegally at one of the border points? And they had recorded 10 million of these encounters over this period of Biden's presidency, whereas they recorded 2.5 million under Donald Trump's 4 years. Now, there are reasons for that, obviously, that go beyond presidential decisions, things to do with, economic collapse in parts of Latin America and those kind of things. But those numbers are absolutely startling. And they do also, you can trace them into some of the swing states and look at the illegal immigration populations in some of these swing states and how much they have gone up. Some of them are really, really amazing in terms of the percentage increase in some of these states. So I think you take those two issues together, and that gives, and then you put on top of that the fact that Kamala Harris was asked to sort of lead on the border crisis. Then you have two core issues that it goes some way to explaining why, despite all of the issues that Donald Trump has, I think he is currently effectively the favorite to win the presidency.
I think that in this sense, it's remarkable that the Democratic candidate, whoever it would have been, is doing as well as that person is doing. And that is really a function of Donald Trump's weaknesses. Because if you think about the elections that have taken place and over the course of the last 18 months or so, and the fate of incumbents, those who were in power at the point in which Russia invaded Ukraine, particularly through the first half of that year, they've all, across the board, done pretty disastrously. One person who's an incumbent who has actually done well, if you look at what happened in the European Parliament elections, like Meloni in Italy, she did not take power in Italy till November of 2022. So when the worst of the inflation was over. And if you then add in the migration question on the Mexican border, there is no European country that has had an experience of its border over the last 4 years that is like the experience of the US-Mexico border. Now, I think brings out for all his skill as a politician, the one thing that Donald Trump does is drive the turnout of his opponents when they are to the left of him, not necessarily when it comes to fighting for the Republican nomination. And that, I think, goes to the heart of why the election was so close last time and may repeat itself this time, and that is Donald Trump won an astonishing number of votes in 2020, I think 72.4 million. Obama didn't get close to that when he won the presidency the first time in 2008, let alone the second time. The truth of the matter is, though, is that Biden won 80 plus million in 2020 because there are so many things that are so viscerally hated about Donald Trump that he drives his opponents to vote against him, even when there are all these things that in normal circumstances would be fatal. And I just think in terms of the scale of what happened to the United States with the inflation experience, and it really starts actually in the second half of 2021, so before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what runs in the American case really till early 2023, is that this is the second worst experience of food and energy inflation since the 1960s in the United States. The only one that's comparable with it is the energy and food inflation shock that came after the Iranian Revolution in 1978. So it's actually, in that sense, worse than what happened as an inflationary experience just on food and energy in the one that's remembered more clearly, the oil price shock of 1973, early 1974. And in terms of, I think, the fact that Trump has had a good month, part of that you can say has been the relief in some sense, I think, of many Democratic voters that Harris was there and not Biden was there, just because it was becoming so difficult to justify Biden being there. But it's also the case that food inflation on a monthly basis for September hit the highest level it's been since the last peak in like early 2023, which might be an explanation about why there's been something of a turn in Trump's favour.
Yeah, I did notice that. There's these videos that are going around of him at McDonald's doing the serving through the hatch. There's also a video of him, Trump this is, at a barber shop in Queens or Brooklyn or somewhere in New York, and the business owner is saying that his energy prices have gone up sort of thousands of dollars in one go, and this is the sort of the core complaint. It's just so strikingly reminiscent of home when you think about what is going on across the. I mean, on that inflation mode, is that's to do with Russia, the Russian invasion mostly, or is it also a Chinese effect?
Well, if you look at it in the one that's hit the Americans the most, it's actually on the oil price side, because they did not have anything like the gas price shock that was experienced by European countries after the termination by the Russians of it actually started before the termination of the Russians of supply through the Nord Stream pipelines. It's really the effect of China's rapid recovery from the pandemic in 2021, or in the second half of 2021, leading to rising oil prices. And you could say, well, that was just a continuity of the story that was there in 2019, and the pandemic came and brought it to an end. So Biden actually starts asking the Saudis to raise oil output through OPEC Plus, the oil producer cartel that it effectively runs with the Russians, in the summer of 2021. So 6 months before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then the next summer, after things have got even worse after the invasion, that's when he goes off to Riyadh and meets bin Salman in person.
We'll turn to foreign policy issues now, because we wanted to run through some of those. We've talked about the domestic issues that we've sort of picked out, but it's also been marked, the Biden presidency, by a pretty tumultuous period in terms of foreign policy, and his own policies being pretty much unwound, and certainly when it comes to the Middle East. But, I think you can look at the polls in the United States, and he takes a real hit that it's not clear that he'd necessarily recovered from the Afghan pullout almost immediately. So, I mean, that's sort of number one. But then right towards the end, we still don't know how the Middle East is going to play into the US election with 2 weeks to go, and whether the Israelis are going to hit Iran, and what that would do to the US election. I mean, my immediate thought is obviously that has a direct effect on gas prices almost straight away.
Yeah, I think if you had wound the clock back to September of 2023 and said, how is the Middle East going to play into the presidential election in a year's time? Nobody could have quite predicted the way in which it now is going to play out. And I think that there's two strands to that. The first of them is that after Hamas's attack on Israel and the actions that Israel took in response to Hamas's attack, that increasingly as the year went on, that the Democratic base split on that question. There was, on the progressive side, let's say, very angry with the administration's backing of Israel as they saw it unequivocally. And then the people some of whom wanted a tougher policy, particularly on the Iran aspects of it. And I think it's fair to say that on this issue, the Democrats are probably more divided than the Republicans are, and that it's proved difficult for Kamala Harris, who has not been someone who's got much of a public persona where foreign policy is concerned, to articulate any clear position on this. She tends, I think, to wander around depending on what she thinks the audience that she's talking to needs to hear.
There's also, of course, sort of Ukraine sort of hanging over us. I mean, it doesn't seem to be playing directly into the election as much. I'd be interested what you think in the Q&A after. But you get questions to Trump, and Trump is saying essentially, I'll end the war. But beyond that, I'm not sure it has the same impact as the Middle East in this election.
I don't think that Ukraine is particularly acting as a divisive question within American voters' perceptions of what's going on in this conflict. I think, though, just to go back to the Iran issue, what you've already raised, Tom, is the possibility that Israel will retaliate against Iran for the attack a few weeks ago. And if it were to attack a target, and that probably wouldn't particularly mean the island in the Persian Gulf, Karg Island, where the Iranians export from, but some Iranian oil processing facility. The Iranians were then going to respond to that by counter-attack, particularly against any state, and this is why I think it won't happen, that had been willing to let its airspace be used by Israel. That would be an absolute disaster for the Democratic candidate. And I think you can see there's this is the weird thing that's now playing out, is in one sense, Netanyahu, as the Israeli leader, can understand that he might be able actually to help Trump win the election by the decisions that he makes in relation to that. The difficulty for Netanyahu in doing that is that the Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia have made it abundantly clear that they will not tolerate Israel using their airspace in order to attack. So there has to be found some military way around that, which is quite difficult, as I understand
just performative.
I don't think it is performative, because it goes back to what we were talking about actually a few episodes ago, in the fact the Saudis are so scared about a repetition of the Iranian attack on their oil facilities in the September of 2019. I mean, for them, I think I used this phrase, and when we were talking about it in that episode, it's like Pearl Harbor for them, how shocking that moment was. So all their signalling over the last few weeks has been to move back closer towards Iran.
It's quite interesting, though, from a Democratic perspective. They must be watching this and thinking, they have been ignored by Netanyahu for much of this conflict. He is being urging restraint, whether it's in Gaza or Lebanon, and Netanyahu is effectively ignoring him and pushing harder and harder. And with each success that Netanyahu has, whether it's killing Nasrallah in Lebanon or Sinwar in Gaza, he is forcing the Democrats, the White House, to release statements saying that this is a great day for America, for the West, that a terrorist has been killed, a great terrorist, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon, which just makes the US policy just look kind of pathetic, because this was something they were trying to stop. The US has, the Biden presidency has come out of this particular war looking particularly weak, ineffective.
I think that's the other way in which this is playing in it, because it is because it creates the perception, whether it's true or whether it's not true, might be another question, but it creates the perception that the United States can't control Israel. And that, for the Democrats, is very problematic, because it has got the progressive base of the Democratic Party that wants a much tougher policy with Israel. And it ends up either, I think, like trying to say to itself, or can only explain what's going on by saying, well, maybe actually the Biden administration is giving more of a green light to privately to Netanyahu than seems like on the surface. But whichever of the interpretations is right, what it doesn't look like is that this White House, with a lame duck president, is in charge of events in any shape or form. And assuming that Netanyahu would be willing to take some risks, as I say, they would involve a set of logistical questions that might not be easy to deal with. He actually has the potential to make things exceptionally difficult for Harris, because the one thing that we understand about this whole story is how utterly damaging significant rises in oil prices are for incumbent candidates.
It's been a period of time now since Israel was attacked by Iran, and it hasn't responded directly yet. And we have 2 weeks to go until the US election. It seems perfectly plausible to me that Israel will hit back in this period of time. And also, it's entirely logical that Netanyahu wants Donald Trump to be president to win this election, because he made absolutely clear that he wanted Donald Trump to win the last election as well. So if he's also making the calculation that Kamala Harris is to the left of Biden, which she is, and she perhaps is going to be less able to face down her left flank, then that will surely be playing into Netanyahu's calculations.
I think, though, it is quite difficult because there's another issue that's come out. There's been quite a bit of commentary about this afternoon, which is that there was a leak of Israeli military plans. So that in itself might be part, at least, and these things are incredibly difficult to say too much sensibly about from the outside, of the explanation about why there hasn't yet been Israeli response. But it's not also like difficult to imagine, and this gets onto the question, I think, of like what the impact of this presidential election is for other parts like of the world. Is a Donald Trump presidency really going to mean a much more confrontational policy with Iran? We can definitely see that the transfer of power from Trump to Biden led to a change in policy, because the Biden administration wanted the nuclear arms deal back with Iran, wasn't able to do so, kept the sanctions in place on Iran's oil exports, but didn't really enforce them. Hence, Iran's back to exporting a bit more than 3 million barrels of oil a day. But the question I think, in one sense, to ask is as things have escalated in this crisis and the future of Iran's nuclear program is on the table, is any American president, whether that's Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, I think certainly not if it's Kamala Harris, but it's not clear to me it would be so if it were Donald Trump, really going to take the decision to support Israel, either Israel acting unilaterally or a joint action to try militarily to destroy Iran's nuclear program, because that creates such a moment like of change in the Middle East, so destabilizing in what its consequences might be, given everything else that's going on, given the fact that the Trump, if you listen to his rhetoric anyway, would seem to be most focused perhaps on what's going on in the Americas. Is that the direction of travel? I don't think it should be taken for granted that it would be. I think that Trump would be a more confrontational generally precedent with Iran, but in the context in which we're now in, where the stakes have been raised as high as they are, that's a different proposition than it was even 6 months ago.
But I guess that is if it's thought through, if it's a kind of coherent strategy that we're talking about here, or whether it's an impulsive decision that is put to him by Israel. Back it or don't back this strike. And then this is going to solve your problems. There's a way of selling it to him. Trump was the one who authorized the assassination of Soleimani, which was a major escalation, but was actually, there is a fairly good argument that it was a successful escalation, and that the Iranians weren't able to hit back in any meaningful way for different reasons. I think there was a downing of the plane, the passenger plane, shortly afterwards. But I could easily see Trump authorizing something from a feeling perspective, that this is something we should be doing. We should be hitting back hard. But I think it comes back to something you said right at the beginning, isn't it? About trying to understand what a Trump presidency in the round means, or a second Trump presidency. Again, we understand who Donald Trump is and where his instincts lie. I think they've been fairly consistent, in fact, his instincts going back to the 80s. He's always been raging against the sense that America is a kind of too soft, and it's the whipping boy, and it's being taken advantage of principally by its allies. Back in the 80s, that was Japan. Obviously, since then, it's become Europe, Germany in particular, and also, obviously not an ally, but China. So his instincts are consistent. But then if you look at the influences around Trump ahead of this election, they're quite hard to pull together into an obviously coherent package. So on the one hand, then you have Vance, his vice president, who has a particular worldview. But even that, it's quite hard to pin down exactly what Vance represents. Does he represent working class Ohio, where he actually represents, or does he represent Silicon Valley interests, and what do those Silicon Valley interests want from a future Trump presidency? Then you have obviously the figure of Elon Musk, which I think is really fascinating to try to understand properly what it is that Elon Musk wants and hopes for from Donald Trump. It seems in some ways to contradict the overall message that Trump is giving out, and that Vance gives out, which is an immediate raising of tariffs across the board on imports into the United States, which will then obviously be replied with tariffs on American goods. Is that what Elon Musk wants? Elon Musk has got massive interests in China, in particular, with Tesla. He's got interests in Germany today. Again, I think he's building a Tesla factory in Germany. So what is it that's going on there? Or is it just is there a simpler explanation about wokery, or whatever it is that Elon Musk is saying? And then there is this Project 2025, which the Democrats are trying to make a lot of hay with, which is this Heritage Foundation report. And I think that is a fascinating piece of work, and it provides something of a model for British think tanks, in that we can all see the problems that the Labour government has today with not having a thought-out plan about what it wants to do when it comes into government. Here is an incredibly detailed plan that a think tank has pulled together. It's a very controversial plan that sets out how a Trump presidency can be radical and how it can grip a system and completely change it. The Heritage Foundation has a history. It was an influential think tank for the Reagan Revolution, with lots of influence here in London as well. So is this a kind of repeat of that? Are we seeing the beginnings of something that can cohere into something genuinely transformative in the way that happened in the 1980s? Or do all of those things pull in completely different directions? I mean, I'm not clear. I don't know if you are.
No, I'm not at all. But I think the place where, in a way, that these contradictions come together is the China question.
Yeah.
Because Trump's, as we know, began this trade war and what became a tech war against China with the tariffs that were put on, started with solar panels and washing machines in 2018. And this was a policy that was not only continued by the Biden administration, it was deepened by the Biden administration. So we're now in the world where the tariffs on electric vehicles coming from China to the United States is 100%. Now, if you're Elon Musk, in terms of what you're trying to do in the American domestic market, that looks like a pretty good thing.
Yeah.
But there's a whole set of complications that, as you already said, Tom, Tesla's got interest in China. This is the same argument that the German car makers are facing, which we were discussing I think earlier in the week, because if you get retaliation against the tariffs you're putting on in the home market by your position in China's market, where do your interests lie? But in the case of America, you've got a backdoor of Chinese electric vehicles into the United States via Mexico because of NAFTA. Does this mean that what Musk is interested in is pushing Trump in the direction of being more confrontational over NAFTA with the Chinese? Sometimes Trump talks the language on electric vehicles of saying it's fine if China sells its cars in America as long as they make them in the United States, which is clearly not going to be Musk's position in all that. Yet at the same time, you can see, I think, that Trump's position on the Taiwan question has actually been moving in a softer direction on China the more that Musk's been involved in the campaign. So you can go earlier in the year and you can see when Trump is pressed on the question about whether the US would militarily defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion, the answer seems to be yes. But in the last few months, he's given answers like, and there was one even only last week, I'll slap 2,000% tariffs or something on them if that, or 200% I think it was, tariffs on them, if that's what that they do. Now, in this sense, given that Biden has been perhaps the most unequivocal American president there's been in a long time, if ever, on defending Taiwan, there may be a world, actually, if Harris is continuity Biden, where it actually might be the flip of it was the way it was in 2016, where the Democrat might end up being tougher. Trump might be more transactional. Having said that, if you look at the kinds of people who earlier in her career, like when she was running for Senate, the Silicon Valley Californian types who were backing Harris were not the same kind of Musk Silicon Valley, then they've been the people who've been in favor of trying to go back to deeper economic independence with China. So I think that trying to disentangle like what the effects of China policy is from this election, depending on who wins, is incredibly difficult, much more so than it's been in either of the other elections. Involving Trump, I mean by that.
But it almost makes you want to just go back to basics and say, well, if you were just going to look at America's interests, and try to rationally understand them, what are they in relation to China and for its domestic politics, and then use that as the guide to what is likely to be American policy, then you might get towards effectively continuity of where we've been going, which has been a general hardening and a moving away from free trade with China into this direction. And after all, that is the direction that's happening in Europe as well. I mean, there was a really interesting piece in Politico the other day, and I talked about this on the podcast, who says, Europe is copying Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods, or Biden's tariffs, depending on how you want to define it, and also copying Trump's policies on the border with these detention centres. So, you can look about, and the other thing that we should say, just as a slight aside, and we have mentioned this on the podcast, but Britain has currently put no tariffs on Chinese electric cars coming into Britain. We're the one country that has opted not to. And again, you could probably explain that just by looking at core national interests, and that we have obviously fewer when it comes to trying to protect an electric car industry that we don't really have much of a one to protect. So we're in a better position just to allow them cheap Chinese cars to come in. That then raises this question again about Trump and how radical is he, and how radical was his first term in terms of foreign policy, and what are his instincts? Is he the guy that wants to end foreign entanglements, foreign wars, because he sees that's just a mug's game? Why is America paying such a high price to keep the peace in all of these parts of the world that I don't care about? That is one instinct. And then there's we have to be strong. And that the Democrats are effectively weak and they don't take the decisions that are necessary to take. They're weak on Iran, they're weak on Soleimani, they're too weak that they allowed Russia to invade Ukraine, and that plays into that. Is anything really going to change in when you sort of boil it down, whether on Ukraine or whether on Iran or any of these, or China, or any of these major questions?
Well, I think that gets us nicely to Ukraine, Tom, because I think the conventional wisdom, if you like, would say, well, that's the one where you can clearly see a difference, even if it's not one in the difference that I think is having significant effect in terms of voters' reactions to the two candidates, that Trump will be looking to make quite early on, force Ukraine to the negotiating table and make a deal. And again, Harris positions herself as the continuity Biden candidate. But what does continuity Biden mean in this respect? Biden has not been backing Ukraine since sometime in 2023, as much as he was in the second half of 2022 and early 2023. If you look at that meeting that he held, or the summit he held in Berlin when he had gone there on the state visit to Germany, and he met with Scholz and Macron and Starmer, he wasn't prepared to give anything like a straightforward commitment to the idea that Zelensky has asked for, which is a formal invitation for Ukraine by the end of the year to join NATO. If you look at American politics through last year, in fact, through the end of 2023 and into 2024, then you had quite a range of opinion that was saying strongly, including strong general foreign policy hawks on the Republican side, like Lindsey Graham and Mitt Romney, who was saying we can't carry on supporting Ukraine unless we can do something about our own border crisis. Now, that broke in the end, and the money did go through. But the direction of travel, I think, is from American detachment from the Ukraine cause, because they're not willing. No American politician is really going to be willing to do the kinds of things that would be necessary for Ukraine to win. So there is a way of looking at this that says, despite all the huge difference in style between the two candidates, everything that seems to be at stake, perhaps in foreign policy terms, less is going to change, or less is going to turn, would be a better way of putting it. Less is going to turn on the outcome than might seem to be the case. But what will change is all these conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, which no American president seems to be able to impose American will upon.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that we should probably finish this half. And I've got one sort of final thought to how they're all tied together, and we can come back to this after. In that there is another incoherence, or sort of a continuity of incoherence, perhaps with Trump, which is that another one of these advisors around him, Elbridge Colby, who's a guy worth looking up, has this idea that the United States is in desperate need to turn its focus away from the Middle East and Europe towards China. But as we were just talking about before we came on, this story is now that there are North Korean soldiers potentially fighting in Ukraine, in Europe. Is it even possible to disentangle from Europe?
And then the South Koreans are now saying they might have to respond to that in some way. And then you have more conflicts in the Korean Peninsula and then over Taiwan. And then you can't start saying that Eurasia is dividable up into a Russia problem and a China problem.
Yeah, America just is sucked back into the same position it's always been. Continuity reigns. We really do appreciate you all coming along. It's been really enjoyable. So thank you so much. And as ever, another shout out to the YouTube audience. Please type in These Times wherever you get your podcasts.